listening to Dallas Theological Seminary's Chapel Podcast.
It's welcoming. It's great to see all of you today for our second chapel focusing on human trafficking. Julie Waters is the director and founder of Free the Captives, an evangelical anti-human trafficking organization. And after practicing family law and child advocacy as an attorney, she brings her legal expertise to the human trafficking issues. She speaks at both local and the national level on human trafficking. She's a native Texas, attended Texas A&M. She received a BA in speech communication there. She's also a graduate of Boston University School of Law and licensed to practice law in both Texas and Massachusetts. She's currently working on her THM at Dallas Theological Seminary at the Houston Extension. And she and her husband, Benjamin, are active members of Access Church there in Houston. We encourage you and invite you to join us for a conversation after chapel for a brown bag in Mitchell 109 in the President's Room. Please welcome Julie Waters.
Good morning. And thank you so much for coming this morning and for singing Victory in Jesus. That was one of my grandmother's most favorite hymns, and she passed away last week. And so I just think it was very, very fitting for that to be sung this morning and to kind of segue into our talk. Checkers, Uno, dominoes. Those were some of my favorite games to play when growing up. After school, I would go to my grandmother's house and we would play these games for hours on end. And she would let me win a lot. But today, a different type of game is being played. It's called the Pimp Game. And the kids trapped in the Pimp Game are American teenaged girls forced into prostitution. The Pimp Game is not a metaphor. It's not a figure of speech. It is a real game. And just like any real game, there are rules. So I want to share this morning some of the rules that the pimps have created for this game. Rule number 1, purse first, sex last. Purse first, sex last. What this rule means is the prostituted girl must give all of her earnings to the pimp before he will engage in a relationship with her. In essence, she is paying for his love. Purse first, sex last. Rule number 2, keep a prostitute in arrears. What this means is keep her financially dependent on the pimp. As one pimp put it, the more someone depends on you, the more power you have over them. And the last rule, a pimp must be qualified to handle damaged souls. A pimp must be qualified to handle damaged souls. Let that sink in for a moment, because that rule disturbs me to my core, and it should disturb you too. Since when did the church give up the care and responsibility of damaged souls to traffickers? Where is the church when she is needed the most? This is a wake-up call this morning for the church to reach out to the wounded, damaged souls. And through God's love, grace, and power, restore these souls to wholeness. So, in order to have a biblical perspective on human trafficking, we need to focus on God as the redeemer and rescuer of slaves. And that is the subject of this morning's message, God as the redeemer and rescuer of slaves. So what we're going to do first is look at God's role in the Old Testament as he redeemed the Israelites out of slavery. Then we're going to move to today and how he's redeeming us from spiritual slavery. And then we're going to see God redeeming physical slaves in the form of human trafficking. So, first of all, in the Old Testament, we see God redeeming the Israelites. They have been slaves for 400 years in Egypt. And then God, using Moses, rescues his people through a dramatic series of events. And after they've been rescued, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is writing to his people, and he urges them to remember what God has done for them. 3 times in the book of Deuteronomy, he says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. He says that 3 times in Deuteronomy 24:18, 15:15, and 5:15. While Moses played a role in their rescue, he rightly points the focus back to God. He is telling the Israelites, remember what God has done for you. And I think that is a clue for all of us to see how we should be doing human trafficking work. It must be done theocentrically. And here's how I explain Free the Captives. We are a theocentric, anti-human trafficking group that is focused or centered around God. Now, human trafficking, by its definition, is anthropocentric, meaning that it's centered or focused on humans. And that makes sense, right? Because it's actual human beings that are being trafficked. Nevertheless, to be effective in this fight, we must be theocentric, not anthropocentric. Therefore, with Free the Captives, our focus is not about what man can do to fight the injustice of trafficking. Rather, our focus is on what the triune God is doing, and then prayerfully seeking how we can be a part of his plan. So just as God redeemed the Israelites from slavery, he is redeeming slaves today. It is a part of his character. It's a fundamental part of who he is. God is our Redeemer, and today he is redeeming both physical and spiritual slaves. So we in this room, we may not understand what it's like to be a teenager trafficked in the sex trade. And we can't comprehend what it means to inherit a $6 debt that forces your entire family to make bricks for 18 hours a day. But what we do understand, and what we have all experienced personally, is being a slave to sin. We don't like to talk about sin in this day and age, but the reality is that we all struggle with it. Sin is a part of our daily lives, and it grieves the heart of God, and it's what keeps us separated from him. It can take all shapes and forms. It can be lust, pride, greed, anger, and worry. Sin can be our master. Recently, I was surprised at how strong sin was in my own life. I shouldn't have been, but it was a particular instance where I was hurt personally. And in my anger, I wanted to retaliate. And it took 2 sisters in Christ to show me that my intended response was spiteful and sinful. Notice that I said 2. It took 2 women, not just one, to show me that my heart was not in the right place, and that my reaction would hurt others and grieve God. In my hurt, I was surprised at how strong my flesh and my will was that day. You see, sin was trying to make me a slave. But the good news is that just like the Israelites, we have a Redeemer. We have someone who can free us from being slaves to sin. Our Redeemer is Jesus, the Son of God. By placing our trust in Jesus, we are no longer slaves to sin because of his death and resurrection. Jesus died a horrific death as a common criminal, when in reality he had done nothing wrong. In fact, he had never even sinned. And that is why we who have sinned can be united with a perfect and holy God. Jesus' death and resurrection redeemed us from our sin. He is our Redeemer. You see, I didn't give in to sin on that day when I was so hurt and angry. I was close, but I didn't. Because of my faith in Christ, I am not a slave to sin. So now we move from spiritual slavery to physical slavery. Modern day slavery is taking the form of human trafficking. And today, we are going to specifically focus on just one sector, and that is domestic minor sex trafficking. Now, before we do that, I want to throw out several caveats. The first is that there are many types of human trafficking, and that sex trafficking is just one component. Labor trafficking is also very large. Secondly, I'm only going to be talking about girls today, but I want you to be aware that boys are also caught up in the sex trafficking trade. Third, I do not mention statistics. And the reason why is the data behind statistics in human trafficking is very poor. So just always be careful of when you hear human trafficking statistics. And the last thing that you need to keep in mind is the federal law that pertains to human trafficking, specifically the section that addresses minors. If you are under the age of 18, the elements of force, fraud, and coercion are not needed to show that you are a victim of human trafficking when it comes to sex trafficking. So what that means is if a minor consents to the act, that minor is still considered a victim of human trafficking. And now you need to keep that in mind for the rest of the message. So, who are these victims of domestic minor sex trafficking? Who are these American girls born and raised in Dallas and in Houston and across the U.S.? Who are these girls? Many of you are aware that they are the homeless, the runaways, and the throwaways. But something else that you need to keep in mind is that these girls sit in your children's classrooms. They play on your child's basketball team. It may even be the girl in your youth group that looks so sad all the time. Sex trafficking knows no boundaries or limits. It doesn't care about socioeconomic status. In Houston, in the suburbs of Houston, we are seeing girls being trafficked. So it's not just an inner city issue. It's in the suburbs. It's everywhere. So how do these girls get caught up in trafficking? To put it very simplistically, in three broad categories. Number one, we have pure violence. Number two, the boyfriend pimp. And number three, survival sex. Now, the first category includes girls who are forced into prostitution through pure brutality and violence. This is often what comes to people's minds when they think of sex trafficking. These are the girls who have been kidnapped and forced into prostitution through sheer violence. They are kept under constant surveillance, and they rightfully fear for their lives and for their families' lives. They are prisoners in a nightmare that will not end. The second category involves the pimp masquerading as the boyfriend. Now, I want you to listen very carefully to this section, because that's where we're seeing most of the girls coming from. This is where the pimp uses love as a snare, and it goes back to the rules in the pimp game. First, he finds a girl from a broken home, and then he knows that she has a damaged soul. And then he gives her the love and attention that she is seeking. Then, skillfully applying the rules of the pimp game, he convinces her to sell his body. If you love me, you'll do this. And if that doesn't work, then he resorts to violence. Once in the pimp's stable, that's what they call the girls that the pimp owned. It's a part of his stable. They are property. Once in the pimp's stable, the girls are kept there by love, drug dependency, pregnancy, fear, and shame. It is not unheard of for the pimp to use the prostituted girl's child as ransom to keep her in this lifestyle. And often, it is the shame of being a prostitute that keeps this girl from returning to her family and school if she has that choice. The last category is survival sex. Now, we see this the most with runaways, the throwaways, and the homeless teens. They are absolutely desperate when they are out on the streets. So in return for food and shelter, they will sell themselves. Now, you may ask, how is this trafficking? Where is the coercion? I want you to remember about the federal law that we spoke about earlier, that if they're under the age of 18, the elements of force, fraud, and coercion are not needed for them to be victims of human trafficking. But what I want you to focus on here in this particular category are the Johns. These are typically male, the men who are purchasing sex, and they're known as the Johns. So this leads me to my last point about human trafficking. There must be a focus on the Johns. Most of the times we focus on the victims and the pimps or the traffickers, and that is crucial, absolutely crucial. But one category that often gets ignored are the Johns. So we can rescue all of the girls and we can jail all of the pimps, but as long as there are Johns out there creating a demand, there will always be a supply. This is simple economics. So we, as the church, must focus on the Johns. There are two ways to do this. First of all, the laws regarding the Johns have to be enforced. So, what do you think happens when a John and a prostituted girl are caught in the act by the police? The John is given a slap on the wrist and told to go home to his wife, while the prostituted girl is either thrown into jail or juvenile detention. Our laws regarding the Johns have to be enforced, and the Johns must take responsibility for their actions. Secondly, I can stand up here and talk until I am blue in the face, and I would be lucky to reach one or two Johns. Men listen to other men. So my challenge to you today, the men in this audience, if you want to fight human trafficking, the way that you can be the most effective is by reaching out to the Johns. That is your responsibility and duty in this fight. So, now that you know a little bit more about domestic minor sex trafficking, what are you going to do about it? Dr. Townsend said in a recent chapel message that if you don't act within 30 days, you lose about 85% of what you've learned. So today, I want to give you a few ideas of what you could do. First of all, the absolute most critical thing you can do is pray. I can't overemphasize this enough. And here's why. We at Free the Captives have seen God do amazing things because of prayer. And prayer is one of our absolute foundations. In fact, the bulk of theocentric human trafficking work is going to be done through prayer. And here's how you can join in. On the second Tuesday of every month, we have an event. It's called Second Tuesdays. And using Facebook, we invite people from all over the world to join us for a day of prayer and fasting. And here's how I know that it works. The very first time we held our very first day of Second Tuesdays, I was at this meeting, and God opened the door for me to meet this woman. And literally, on the first day that people were praying and fasting, one of our most significant ministries was born. And that's our ministry where we train Christian women to mentor human trafficking victims and girls at risk. So that is what happens when God's people come together and pray. The second thing that you can do is, if you're not already involved, get involved. But first, pray, and then get involved. I would love for you to join Free the Captives. We are a completely volunteer-run group, including myself. And we always need more volunteers. Our volunteer philosophy is to discover how God gifted you and then help you use your particular gifting in this fight. We can even use volunteers remotely. For example, Camille Holland of DTS created this beautiful flyer that is advertising our conference in Houston this weekend. We need a new website developer. We have a missions trip to India this summer that you can join. And we have a speakers bureau where we're training people to go out and talk about human trafficking. The needs are great. So pray and figure out where God can use you. So just as God redeemed the Israelites out of slavery, and just as he has redeemed us from spiritual slavery, so he is in the business of redeeming human trafficking victims today. Fight human trafficking theocentrically. Seek him and then join in. Thank you.